says I support church finances. And I also say a lot of people are living above their means, and therefore they can't tithe because they are living above their means. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 12 to 14 gives the equality principle. Now, I look at that equality principle as saying there are many in the church that could and should give more than 10%. A lot of rich people stop at 10%. I've met God's, what it requires. A lot of people in church should give more than 10%. But there's some people who are giving sacrificially, even though 1 or 2%. Even that hurts them because they still got to come home and worry about medicine and food and shelter. And the equality, it averages out. Those who give more than 10% and those who get less, it averages out. And equality doesn't mean that everybody gives the same percentage. It means the principle that everybody gives to the best of your ability. Don't set a percentage and don't start at 10%.
Okay. So the principle is giving
sacrificially.
Sacrificial giving.
As Christ gave sacrificially.
Right.
Do not look at percentages.
Right.
Look at what point, some people have never given to the point they might go home and miss it. Mm. Well, I can't go to the lake or to the festival or, some amusement park now because some people have never reached that point. They have not given sacrificially. They may give a tithe, but they have never given to the point where it actually amounted to something where they actually noticed it out of their checkbook. Mm-hmm.
And what you're saying also to be free as to where you give this, not necessarily to the local church.
I think the local church should be foremost.
Okay.
At the same time, I point out in the Old Testament, the tithe, not one tithe in the Old Testament ever went to support a mission station where the Jews and the Levites and the priests took that tithe and went out and built a mission station to convert the Gentiles. There is no precedent there. Neither in the Old Testament is there any time where the tithe was ever used to build the temple or church buildings. There's no precedent there.
Okay.
So if there's no precedent in the Old Testament, how can you say, well, today we use tithes to pay for missionaries? I'm all for supporting missionaries, but don't call it tithing. Call it sacrificial free will giving.
Okay, that's it. Don't you think, Mike, that there is a problem here, that if you say 10% and if you say tithing, many people are going to say, that's all I'm going to give, and the only problem they have is, do they tithe on the gross or on the net? How many times I've heard that go on, and we're not going to get into that tonight. But don't you think there is a problem even saying that tithing is a principle, and not taking it completely out onto sacrificial giving?
I see tithing as a discipline that you can be challenged to start. Because anybody that I've been privileged to teach has gone from tithing to giving beyond the tithe. So when given, that's why I wanted to establish the principle of giving. I said I wanted to say that before we go.
Is the principle a doctrine? I mean, you were asked that.
They're similar. They're similar in many respects. They're similar, and I like what somebody said that don't we think the tithe is obsolete now and all of that? And in a sense, yeah, because of the Old Testament way of practicing the tithe. I think I like what Russell has said as well about sacrificial giving. My question is, how do you get people to the point of sacrificial giving if there's no structured training that brings them to sacrificial giving? Nobody's going to wake up one morning and say, I'm going to give everything I've got. There's going to be a teaching process that brings people to the place of sacrificial giving. You see what I'm saying?
I could come back on that, but you come back on that, Russell.
There are churches out there that have been teaching tithing for generations, and they still got 20 or 30 members.
Okay.
The secret to a growing church is not that you teach tithing. I'll guarantee you don't teach tithing that often. I can tell. I'll bet you when you stand up before your church, you teach soul winning and evangelism and salvation sermons.
I do.
And your members run out that door, oh, I tithe today. No, they say, oh, people got saved today, and I want more people to save. I'm going to give more because I want to get more people to save. It ain't got nothing to do with tithing. It's evangelism and personally teaching people how to lead others to Christ. They got nothing to do with tithing.
Okay.
John MacArthur in the United States has 20,000 member church. They don't teach tithing. Everybody says, how in the world is our church going to survive if we don't teach tithing? preach soul winning and personal evangelism. It'll thrive. You ain't got to mention tithing. People are going to run out that church wanting to give money.
I think the thing I wanted to, that was very eloquently put, but better than I could have put it. But the thing I wanted to ask on that is you said, yeah, let's start with the tithe and move on. It seems to me that so many churches I hear that teach tithing never get beyond that. Every week it's tithing, tithing. You are saying, let's start with that tithing so that... I don't hear that happening.
Yeah, because you haven't listened to me. I'm sorry about that. Anyway,
Okay.
The point I'm making is, R.T. Kendall, I have his book here, he talks a lot about tithing, because he mentioned a few of the British guys. R.T. Kendall is one of the recent ones.
Was he British?
He was he was American, but he's American, but he was in the Westminster Chapel. Okay. So the point I'm making is this. You see, the whole concept of discipleship is process, not the spirit of it. A lot of times we do more damage than good. In the sense that, for instance, when I hear, should the church teach tithing, my mind goes to, should the church teach giving rather than say tithing? Now, if the word tithing connotes Old Testament alone, then, you could argue a point. But if the word tithing means tenth, then I could say, you know what, Abraham did it. So if I disciple anybody, for instance, I wouldn't teach them, once you've paid your tithe, you've done all. No, I'm going to let them understand that, as a believer, your whole life belongs to God.
Amen.
And so let me run. And so your respect for God's role in your finances starts by you honoring God with your time.
Absolutely, but I'm not convinced and that happens with the word tithing, because don't you think that many people take that word tithing and actually just look upon it as like the Old Testament and the 10%?
Well, if they do that, that's because they either are not living out the reality of the New Testament themselves, or they're just limited in their understanding.
How much of tithing is actually taught in the New Testament, Russell?
After Calvary, before Calvary, Jesus mentioned it 3 times, and in each case, he's actually condemning the tithe payers, the tithe teachers. So Jesus taught under the law. He was teaching matters of the law. And if Jesus had not taught tithing, he would have been a sinner. He could not have saved me. So Jesus had to teach tithing because it was under the law still. He also couldn't have taught the Gentiles to tithe, because they wouldn't have accepted that. So he couldn't teach the Gentiles to tithe. Outside of Jesus, the only time tithing is mentioned is in Hebrews chapter 7. And there, let me say what Hebrews chapter 7 says. We believe this first use law, that the first time a text is used, it means more. Well, Hebrews 7:5 says, for the priest have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law. So you've got the first time in Hebrews the word tithe, the word commandment, and the word law appear. Therefore, I say verse 5 is a key verse. Well, you look at verse 12, and it says, for the priesthood being changed, there is of necessity a change also of the law. That's right. Well, it has to be referring at least to the law of tithing in verse 5, because it's the only other time in Hebrews 7 he's mentioned the word law. Well, what was the priesthood changed to? It was changed from Aaron to Melchizedek. Oh, but was it changed to paying the tithes to Levite and Aaron, or from them to the gospel workers? No, because in verse 18, he said, therefore, there is a disannulling of the commandment going before. Well, the commandment going before is the priest have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law. Therefore, the change was from the commandment of the people to take tithes to it's being disannulled. It's been abolished. It no longer exists. I don't know how you can explain that any clearer.
Can you explain that any clearer?
Yes, I'll try. Now, what I read here is that he was saying that Melchizedek is a type of Christ. Now, once again, why would he be emphasizing that even the Levites gave tithe in the bosom of Abraham? what's the significance about that? If he was trying to teach only the change of the Levitical priesthood, why was he making it clear that there's the one who came in the person and the type of the Son of God to take tithes from Abraham, and even the Levites who were to take tithe under the law gave tithes in the bosom or in the loins of Abraham? That means that God must think something about the tithe. That's the way I read that. And so when I read the change of the Levitical priesthood, I also read the change of tithing from Aaron to Christ.
Okay. Okay.
What text?
What text? The
What
same
text says it was changed from Aaron to Christ?
the same one you just read.
Verse 18 says, therefore there is a disannulling of the commandment going before it.
Yes.
It didn't change it to Christ, it disannulled it.
Who is the new
It
high
abolished
priest?
it.
Who is the new high priest?
Yeah, but he's saying it's using the word abolished, which
I'm
is
asking
there,
for a text. You
Yeah.
didn't give me
which
one.
is.
Well, I can if you
yeah,
want.
So yeah, okay, but on that, with that one thing, and maybe we're going to go to our audience. Maybe
Yeah.
some of them have got some thoughts
Yeah.
on Hebrews 7
Yeah.
or some of the other
Yeah.
things you've been talking about. Don't you feel that the lack of teaching of tithing in the New Testament is significant?
Yeah, there is some significance there. Like I said, when I started preparing for this, I realized how much that what the opposing view has to say has some point. But what it just did to me was to adjust my emphasis rather than take it out completely. In the sense that if the New Testament saints did not teach it directly as tithe, but inferred it many times, because if you read 1 Corinthians 9, when Paul was speaking, he said, didn't the Lord himself ordain that those who preach the gospel should live by the gospel? And he also referred to, if you have sown spiritual things to you, it's not great if you reap carnal things, and though you know who those who minister about holy things in the temple, and they which wait at the altar are partakers at the altar. And all of this was taken from Numbers 18, and where the tithe was